In the heart of California's Santa Clara Valley stands a mansion that looks less like a home and more like a confession carved into wood and stone. The Winchester Mystery House is not just an architectural oddity, it is a reflection of America's most turbulent century, built from grief, gunpowder, and guilt. To understand why this house exists, we must first understand the nation that made it possible. The story begins in the mid-19th century, when America was expanding westward at a brutal pace. Railroads cut through indigenous land. Wars were fought over territory, and firearms became the tools of both survival and slaughter. At the center of this transformation was the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The Winchester rifle, famously called the gun that won the West, reshaped American warfare and frontier life. It was efficient, deadly, and profitable beyond imagination. Every trigger pulled echoed with money, flowing into the Winchester family fortune. Sarah Lockwood Winchester married into this empire. She was educated, artistic, and refined, far removed from the blood-soaked battlefields and lawless towns where Winchester rifles were used. But tragedy followed her closely. In 1866, her infant daughter died from a mysterious illness. Years later, her husband William Winchester succumbed to tuberculosis. Within a short span, Sarah inherited both unimaginable wealth and unbearable loss. In an era where women rarely controlled such fortunes, she became one of the richest widows in America, and one of the most haunted. This was also a time when Americans were desperately searching for meaning after catastrophe. The Civil War had killed over 600,000 people, leaving families shattered and spirits broken. Out of this grief emerged the spiritualist movement, which promised communication with the dead. As seances, mediums, and spirit photography became mainstream, even among the wealthy and educated, Sarah Winchester was no exception. According to legend, she consulted a medium who told her that the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were seeking revenge. The only way to survive, she was warned, was to build a house that would never be finished. Whether Sarah truly believed this prophecy, or whether it was a way to cope with grief, is still debated. What is certain is what she did next. In 1886, she moved west to California and purchased a modest farmhouse. Then she began building, and building, and building. For nearly 38 years, construction never stopped. Carpenters worked day and night. Walls were torn down as soon as they were finished. Staircases led to ceilings. Doors opened into empty space. Windows were placed in floors. Nothing followed logic, except one rule: the house could never be complete. This constant construction mirrored America's own restless expansion. Like the nation itself, the Winchester house grew without a master plan, fueled by money and fear. Sarah reportedly slept in a different room every night, believing spirits could not find her if she kept moving. She incorporated the number 13 obsessively: 13 steps, 13 windows, 13 panels, suggesting a belief system rooted in superstition rather than architecture. But behind the myths is a more human story. Sarah Winchester rarely appeared in public. She dressed simply, avoided attention, and gave generously to charity. Workers described her as kind but distant. She paid them well, even during economic downturns, providing stability in an era of uncertainty. This contradicts the image of a madwoman haunted by ghosts. Instead, it paints the picture of a woman isolated by grief, wealth, and expectations in a society that did not know what to do with her. As the mansion grew more bizarre, so did public fascination. Newspapers exaggerated stories. Tour guides embellished rumors. By the early 20th century, the house was already becoming a legend. When Sarah died in 1922, construction stopped instantly, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. She left behind no explanation. No diary confirming spirits. No confession of madness. Just a labyrinth of rooms that forced Americans to fill in the blanks themselves. The Winchester Mystery House became a mirror for America's obsession with curses. It allowed people to personify guilt over violence, colonization, and industrial greed. Rather than confront the moral cost of the Winchester rifle, it was easier to blame ghosts. The mansion transformed into a tourist attraction, then a cultural symbol, then a horror icon. Hollywood films, paranormal investigations, and ghost stories kept the legend alive, even as historians attempted to ground it in reality. Yet the darkness of the Winchester house does not come from spirits roaming its halls. It comes from what it represents. A fortune built on mass death. A woman crushed by personal loss. A nation running from its own reflection. The house stands today not as proof of a curse, but as evidence of how Americans turned trauma into myth, architecture into legend, and history into haunting. Every crooked staircase and sealed doorway tells a story not of ghosts, but of grief, fear, and an era that refused to slow down, even when surrounded by the dead. The Winchester rifle fortune was born at the exact moment America chose speed, power, and domination over restraint. To understand how this wealth came into existence, one must step into the mid-19th century, when the United States was not yet a finished nation, but a violent experiment in expansion. The country was pushing westward with relentless force, driven by the belief in manifest destiny. The idea that Americans were divinely ordained to control the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This belief was not abstract philosophy. It was enforced with steel rails, broken treaties, and gunfire. Few objects symbolized this transformation more clearly than the Winchester rifle. Before the Winchester, firearms were slow and cumbersome. A soldier or settler fired once, then reloaded under pressure, often with deadly consequences. The repeating rifle changed everything. With its lever action mechanism, a single person could fire multiple rounds rapidly without reloading. This technological leap altered the balance of power instantly. What once required numbers now required only machinery. The Winchester rifle did not merely improve combat efficiency, it redefined who could survive, who could conquer, and who would be erased. As America expanded westward, the rifle became inseparable from the frontier myth. Settlers carried it in wagons crossing plains littered with bones. Lawmen wielded it in towns that sprang up overnight and vanished just as quickly. Militias used it to enforce land claims against native tribes whose own weapons were no match for industrial firepower. The rifle was marketed not as a tool of killing, but as a symbol of independence and progress. Advertisements portrayed it as a companion for brave pioneers, glossing over the reality that its success depended on constant violence. This era was marked by a chain reaction of bloodshed. Treaties signed with Native American nations were routinely violated when land became valuable. Entire communities were displaced or destroyed as settlers moved in, backed by federal troops armed with repeating rifles. Conflicts, such as the Indian Wars, were not isolated skirmishes. They were systematic campaigns, enabled by superior weapons. The Winchester rifle allowed small units to overpower larger forces, turning resistance into massacre. Each engagement added to the rifle's reputation and to the company's profits. At the same time, America was emerging from the Civil War, a conflict that killed more citizens than any other in the nation's history. The war accelerated industrial weapon production and normalized mass killing on an unprecedented scale. Although Winchester rifles were not the primary arms of the Union Army early on, the war created a culture where innovation in firearms was not only accepted but celebrated. After the war, millions of veterans returned home accustomed to violence, moving west in search of land and opportunity. They brought with them a familiarity with guns and a willingness to use them. The Winchester rifle fit perfectly into this new American identity. The company's fortune grew as the nation's conscience hardened. Violence became transactional. Each rifle sold meant another potential death, but also another step toward civilization, as defined by the era. Railroads depended on armed protection. Mining companies relied on force to secure claims. Ranchers fought bloody range wars over grazing land. Everywhere conflict arose, the Winchester rifle was present. It became an equalizer in theory, but in practice it favored those backed by wealth, industry, and government authority. The phrase, "the gun that won the West," was not just marketing, it was an admission. The West was not won through diplomacy or coexistence. It was won through intimidation and extermination. Entire ways of life vanished under the pressure of firearms and policy. Bison herds were slaughtered en masse, not only for profit, but to starve native populations into submission. The rifle made such acts efficient. The Winchester Company benefited not from isolated events, but from a system of continuous conflict that stretched across decades. By the time the United States reached the Pacific, the Winchester name was synonymous with power. The rifles were exported globally, used in foreign conflicts, colonial ventures, and revolutions. The fortune grew not because America was peaceful, but because it was perpetually at war, with others and with itself. This wealth was clean on paper, but stained in origin. Yet society rarely questioned it. Industrialists were praised. Innovation was admired. The moral cost was buried beneath narratives of progress and destiny. This is the context into which Sarah Winchester inherited her wealth. She did not build the rifles, but she lived inside the shadow they cast. Every dollar she possessed was tied to a history of conquest and death. Unlike the factory owners and executives, who publicly embraced the power of industry, she inherited the outcome without the illusion of control. The violence that built the fortune could not be undone, only remembered or avoided. America itself struggled with this legacy. As the frontier closed, the nation romanticized the very violence that shaped it. Dime novels turned gunmen into heroes. Wild West shows transformed massacres into entertainment. The Winchester rifle became a relic of bravery rather than a tool of domination. This rewriting of history allowed Americans to celebrate expansion without mourning its victims. The fortune survived because the story surrounding it was carefully managed. Yet beneath the mythology, the truth remained. The Winchester rifle was efficient because it was designed for killing. Its success was measured not in innovation alone, but in bodies left behind. The expansion era was not a natural unfolding of destiny. It was enforced through superior weaponry and institutional power. The rifle did not create America's violence, but it amplified it, accelerated it, and monetized it. As cities replaced frontier towns and factories replaced open plains, the physical violence moved out of sight. But its consequences lingered. The wealth accumulated during this era shaped American class structures, political influence, and cultural values. Families, like the Winchesters, stood at the intersection of progress and destruction. Their fortunes were admired, envied, and rarely questioned. The violent expansion era ended geographically, but its mindset persisted. The belief that technology could justify domination, that success excused suffering, became embedded in American identity. The Winchester rifle was one of the earliest mass-produced symbols of this philosophy. It proved that innovation without moral restraint could reshape a nation and devastate countless lives in the process. In this sense, the Winchester fortune was not cursed by ghosts, but by history. It was built during a time when America chose conquest over compassion, speed over reflection, and power over accountability. The rifles changed hands countless times, but the legacy remained fixed. Every lever pulled echoed the same truth. America's rise was inseparable from its violence, and the wealth that emerged from it carried that weight forward, generation after generation. Sarah Winchester's life was shaped not by spectacle, but by quiet devastation. Long before she became associated with ghosts, curses, or architectural madness, she was a deeply private woman whose world collapsed piece by piece in ways that mirrored the fragility of 19th century American life. Her personal tragedies did not arrive all at once. They accumulated slowly, each loss compounding the last, until grief became the defining force of her existence. Born in 1839 into a well-educated family, Sarah Lockwood Pardee grew up immersed in music, languages, and refinement. She was intelligent, soft-spoken, and intellectually curious, traits that set her apart in an era that expected women to remain ornamental rather than contemplative. When she married William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester repeating arms fortune, her life appeared secure, even privileged. Yet wealth offered no immunity against the era's most common heartbreak, death. In 1866, Sarah gave birth to her only child, Annie Pardee Winchester. The infant survived just a few weeks, dying from marasmus, a wasting disease that doctors of the time barely understood. For Sarah, the loss was not only emotional but existential. In the 19th century, motherhood was seen as a woman's primary purpose, and child loss often carried a silent stigma of failure or divine punishment. There were no grief counselors, no language for trauma. Mothers were expected to mourn quietly and move on. Sarah did not. Accounts from those close to her suggest she never fully recovered from Annie's death. She withdrew emotionally, throwing herself into music and study, but the absence remained permanent. This loss fractured her sense of continuity, of future. For many parents, children represent survival beyond death. When Annie died, that future died with her. Years later, another blow arrived. William Winchester, already frail, contracted tuberculosis, a slow and merciless disease. Sarah watched her husband weaken day by day, fully aware there was no cure. In 1881, William died, leaving Sarah widowed at just 42 years old. She inherited more than $20 million, an astronomical sum at the time, and a controlling interest in one of the most powerful arms companies in the world. Overnight, she became one of the wealthiest women in America and one of the most isolated. The psychological impact of these losses cannot be overstated. Sarah lost her child, than her husband. Within a society that gave women few acceptable outlets for grief, she had no remaining immediate family, no children, and no clearly defined role. Wealth intensified her isolation rather than alleviating it, while others viewed her fortune as a blessing. For Sarah it became a burden. Money accumulated through instruments of death, arriving in her life only after everything she loved was gone. This emotional vacuum formed the foundation for her spiritual beliefs. During the late 19th century, spiritualism was not fringe superstition. It was a widespread cultural movement. Following the Civil War, millions of Americans were grieving lost relatives. Traditional religion often failed to provide comfort or answers. Spiritualism offered something radical, the promise that the dead were still present, still communicative, and still listening. Seances, spirit mediums, automatic writing, and ghost photography flourished, particularly among the educated elite. Even respected scientists and intellectuals explored spiritual phenomena. For someone like Sarah Winchester, educated, grieving, searching, spiritualism offered not escapism, but hope. It suggested that death was not final, and that the boundary between worlds was thin. According to popular legend, Sarah consulted a Boston medium who told her that she was being haunted by the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles. These spirits, the story goes, demanded appeasement. The medium allegedly warned her that death would come if she stopped building a house for them. While this tale has been embellished over time, what matters more than its literal truth is what it reveals about how Sarah's beliefs were interpreted by others. There is no surviving written proof that Sarah believed she was cursed in the dramatic way later storytellers claimed. What does exist are patterns of behavior consistent with someone deeply shaped by grief and spiritual contemplation. She attended seances, yes, but so did many wealthy Americans. She believed in signs, symbolism, and numerology, but again, these were common spiritual frameworks of the time. Her belief system appears less like paranoia and more like a private theology, one in which responsibility, guilt, and continuity mattered deeply. Sarah lived with the awareness that her wealth was born from violence, even if she never touched a rifle herself. Spiritualism allowed her to personalize that abstraction. Instead of faceless casualties, there were spirits, individuals with stories, grievances, and voices. When she moved to California and began building what would become the Winchester House, construction became a form of ritual rather than shelter. The house was not designed to impress or to dominate. It was inward-facing, defensive, and labyrinthine. It reflected a mind attempting to reconcile permanence with impermanence. Each room built was an acknowledgement of existence. Each room torn down was an acceptance of loss. Sarah reportedly held nightly seances in a small room within the house. Whether these seances were literal attempts to communicate with the dead or symbolic acts of meditation remains unclear. But they suggest a woman actively engaging with her grief rather than denying it. She did not flee from death. She tried to understand it. Her fixation on continuous construction has often been framed as madness, but there is another interpretation. In a life defined by endings, death of a child, death of a husband, end of family lineage, building without completion, was a refusal to accept finality. As long as construction continued, something was still happening. The house was alive. Motion replaced stillness. Noise replaced silence. Sarah's use of spiritual symbolism throughout the house also reflects intentional meaning, rather than chaos. The repeated use of the number 13, for instance, has been sensationalized as superstition. Yet 13 has varied symbolic meanings, including transformation, rebirth, and liminality. It exists between order and disorder, much like Sarah's life. Importantly, those who worked closely with her did not describe her as irrational. Carpenters and servants spoke of her as polite, generous, and meticulous. She paid fair wages, funded ongoing employment during economic downturns, and treated workers with respect. These are not the actions of someone consumed by terror. They are the actions of someone exercising control in a world that once stripped her of it. Her spirituality also appears to have included compassion. Sarah donated anonymously to hospitals, schools, and causes supporting women. She avoided publicity and rejected social elitism. If she believed in spirits, she did not fear them in the way horror stories suggest. Instead, she coexisted with the idea of the dead, giving them space architecturally and psychologically. By the time Sarah died in 1922, she left behind no manifesto, no diary explaining her beliefs. This silence allowed others to invent explanations for her. A grieving woman became a haunted widow. Spiritual curiosity became insanity. Complexity was flattened into spectacle. What remains undeniable is that Sarah Winchester's tragedies shaped every decision she made. Her beliefs did not emerge from irrational fear, but from loss compounded by responsibility. She lived at the intersection of private grief and public violence, carrying a fortune that symbolized American progress and American bloodshed simultaneously. Her spirituality was not about ghosts roaming hallways. It was about acknowledging the unseen weight of history, mourning lives lost, personal and collective, and refusing to pretend that wealth erased consequence. In a nation eager to celebrate expansion and suppress its costs, Sarah Winchester embodied the discomfort many preferred to ignore. She did not build her house to escape the dead. She built it to live with them. The rise of spiritualism in post-Civil War America was not a strange detour in history. It was a direct response to mass death, shattered belief systems, and a society struggling to understand loss on an unprecedented scale. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States was victorious on paper, but emotionally ruined. Over 600,000 soldiers were dead, and millions of families were left without fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers. Death had arrived suddenly, violently, and often without closure. Bodies were buried far from home, unmarked or unidentified. For many Americans, there were no final words. No funerals, no graves to visit. This absence created a psychological wound that traditional religion could not easily heal. Before the war, most Americans believed in a structured Christian worldview where death was tragic but orderly. Heaven, hell, and divine purpose offered comfort. The Civil War disrupted that certainty. The scale of suffering raised unbearable questions. Why would God allow such slaughter? Why were the faithful not spared? Why did young men die screaming in muddy fields, while politicians spoke of glory? Ministers struggled to answer these questions. Sermons about divine will felt hollow to parents staring at empty chairs. Faith did not disappear, but it fractured. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped spiritualism, a belief system that promised something radical yet deeply comforting. The dead were not gone. They were nearby, aware, and reachable. Spiritualism taught that the soul survived death, and could communicate with the living through mediums. This idea spread rapidly because it addressed the one thing Americans wanted most after the war. Not forgiveness, not meaning, but contact. Spiritualism had existed in America before the Civil War, but it was considered fringe. After the war, it exploded into the mainstream. Seances became social events. Newspapers reported spirit communications alongside political news. Parlors were rearranged into sacred spaces where families gathered in silence, waiting for knocks, raps, or whispered messages. People did not attend seances for entertainment alone. They attended because they were desperate. One of the most powerful aspects of spiritualism was that it bypassed religious authority. Unlike churches, which required faith and submission, spiritualism offered direct experience. You did not need a priest to tell you your loved one was at peace. You could hear it yourself, or believe you did. This sense of personal connection was revolutionary. It shifted spiritual power away from institutions and into living rooms, particularly into the hands of women. Women played a central role in the rise of spiritualism. Many of the most famous mediums were female, partly because society already associated women with emotional sensitivity and intuition. But this movement also gave women a rare form of authority. A female medium could command silence, lead rituals, and speak with spiritual certainty in ways that were otherwise denied to women in public life. In a culture that limited female voices, spiritualism quietly elevated them. Grief and gender intersected here. Mothers who lost sons, wives who lost husbands, sisters who lost brothers found meaning in becoming intermediaries between worlds. For some, mediumship was sincere belief. For others, it was a psychological coping mechanism. For a few, it became a profession. Regardless of motive, the movement spread because it met emotional needs no other system addressed. Scientific curiosity also fueled spiritualism's growth. The 19th century was an era obsessed with progress and discovery. Electricity, telegraphs, photography, and railroads were transforming daily life. Invisible forces now moved messages across continents. In that context, the idea that unseen spiritual forces could exist no longer seemed impossible. If electricity could carry a voice through wire, why couldn't spirits carry messages through people? Some scientists and intellectuals investigated spiritualist phenomena seriously. They attended seances, documented movements of objects, and attempted to measure the unmeasurable. While many later debunked these events as fraud, the fact that respected figures engaged with spiritualism lent it credibility. It blurred the boundary between science and faith, suggesting that the afterlife might one day be proven rather than believed. Importantly, spiritualism also aligned with broader reform movements. Many spiritualists supported abolition, women's rights, and social equality. They believed that spiritual progress mirrored moral progress. If souls continued beyond death, then injustice in life mattered deeply. This made spiritualism attractive to those already questioning traditional power structures. It was not only a belief system, it was a quiet rebellion against rigid hierarchies. Yet the movement also had a darker side. Fraud was common. Some mediums exploited grief for money, staging elaborate tricks to convince clients their loved ones were present. Newspapers exposed scandals, and skeptics ridiculed believers. But exposure did not kill the movement. If anything, it strengthened it. For believers, fraud among some mediums did not invalidate the possibility of genuine contact. It simply meant discernment was required. Spiritualism thrived because it was flexible. It did not demand strict doctrine. People could believe selectively. One could accept spirit communication without abandoning Christianity entirely. One could attend church on Sunday and a séance on Tuesday. This adaptability made spiritualism resilient. It wove itself into daily life rather than replacing existing beliefs. In wealthy circles, spiritualism took on a more refined form. Séances were held in elegant homes, conducted quietly rather than theatrically. These gatherings were private, contemplative, and intellectual. Participants discussed philosophy, ethics, and destiny alongside spiritual messages. For the elite, spiritualism was less about spectacle and more about existential inquiry. This is the environment in which Sarah Winchester lived. As a wealthy, educated woman who experienced profound personal loss, she belonged to the exact demographic spiritualism attracted most strongly. Her interest was not unusual. What made her story unique was not belief, but circumstance. Her fortune came from instruments of death. Her grief was compounded by awareness of violence on a national scale. Spiritualism gave her a language to process both. Post-Civil War America was haunted, not metaphorically, but culturally. The dead were everywhere in memory, in photographs, in amputated bodies moving through cities. Mourning clothing became a permanent wardrobe for many women. Cemeteries expanded rapidly. Death was no longer distant, it was intimate. Spiritualism emerged because Americans refused to accept silence as the final answer. The movement also reflected a broader discomfort with finality. The war had ended, but its consequences had not. Reconstruction failed to deliver justice. Racial violence continued. Veterans carried trauma without vocabulary. In this atmosphere, the idea that history itself lingered, that nothing truly ended, felt emotionally accurate. By the late 19th century, spiritualism began to decline as skepticism increased and new scientific explanations emerged. But its influence never disappeared. It reshaped how Americans talked about death, grief, and the unseen. It normalized the idea that emotional truth mattered as much as empirical proof. It allowed people to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it. Most importantly, spiritualism revealed something essential about post-Civil War America. The nation was not ready to let go of its dead. It was not prepared to move forward cleanly. The ghosts of the war, real and imagined, remained embedded in culture, architecture, and belief. In that sense, spiritualism was not about escaping reality. It was about confronting a reality too painful to accept directly. It offered Americans a way to acknowledge loss without surrendering to despair. It allowed them to believe that suffering did not vanish into nothingness, but transformed into presence. This cultural current shaped individuals differently, but its roots were collective. Spiritualism rose because America had witnessed too much death too quickly. It was the language of a wounded nation trying to speak to itself across the silence left by war. The nonstop construction of the Winchester House was not random chaos. It was the physical collision of fear, guilt, and limitless wealth inside a single human life. To outsiders, the hammering, sawing, and rebuilding appeared irrational, even theatrical. But within the emotional and historical context of late 19th century America, the constant construction begins to look less like madness and more like a private ritual shaped by forces far larger than one woman. Sarah Winchester lived in an age when wealth could insulate a person from hardship, but not from conscience. Her fortune was effectively infinite by contemporary standards. She never needed to budget, never needed to prioritize, never needed to stop. Money flowed steadily from the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, regardless of what she did. For most Americans, construction is constrained by necessity. For Sarah, it was constrained only by imagination and belief. This absence of limits is crucial. When there is no financial pressure to finish, completion loses meaning. Fear played a subtle but powerful role. Not fear in the cinematic sense of ghosts lunging from corridors, but a quieter, more persistent fear, the fear of stillness. In Sarah's life, stillness had always preceded loss. Silence followed the death of her child. Quiet rooms followed the death of her husband. Empty spaces became emotional threats. Construction noise, by contrast, meant activity. It meant time was moving. It meant something was happening instead of ending. The house became a defense against finality. As long as walls were going up somewhere, nothing was truly over. This logic does not require belief in literal spirits to be psychologically compelling. Many people cope with trauma through constant motion, work, travel, repetition. Sarah simply had the means to build her coping mechanism into physical reality. Guilt, however, gave that coping mechanism a moral dimension. Sarah did not inherit wealth from railroads or textiles. She inherited it from weapons. Every month, money arrived that was indirectly tied to violence, past, present, and future. In an era increasingly aware of industrial death, this mattered. The Winchester rifle was celebrated publicly, but privately its consequences were undeniable. Newspapers reported massacres, wars, and frontier conflicts in which repeating rifles played central roles. Sarah was not responsible for designing or selling the rifles, but inheritance does not erase awareness. Guilt does not require direct action. It requires identification. Sarah could not separate her comfort from others' suffering. The house became a space where that guilt could be expressed without confession. Building rooms that served no purpose, staircases that led nowhere, and doors that opened into walls mirrored a moral uncertainty, progress without resolution. The nonstop construction also reflected a deeper anxiety about control. Sarah had no control over death when it took her daughter. No control when it took her husband. But she had absolute control over the house. Walls could be moved. Plans could be changed overnight. What was built yesterday could be destroyed tomorrow. In a world that had repeatedly reminded her of her powerlessness, the house became the one domain where her will was unquestioned. Workers followed her instructions without argument. Architects were unnecessary. There was no master blueprint, because there was no desire for final form. Control existed in the act itself, not in the outcome. This is why the house feels disorienting. It was never meant to guide visitors. It was meant to respond to one person's internal state, moment by moment. Wealth ensured this process could continue indefinitely. Most people who live in fear or guilt are eventually forced to confront reality through financial limitation. Sarah never was. She could afford to change her mind endlessly. If a room felt wrong, it could be altered. If a hallway felt complete, it could be disrupted. There was no external force demanding efficiency, logic, or closure. This is where wealth becomes dangerous, not morally, but psychologically. Unlimited resources remove natural stopping points. They allow internal anxieties to expand outward unchecked. The Winchester House grew not because Sarah wanted grandeur, but because nothing forced her to stop building. The house became an echo chamber for her internal world. The constant construction also reflected the broader American mindset of the time. The nation itself was building nonstop: railroads, factories, cities, often without clear ethical frameworks. Expansion did not pause to reflect. It pushed forward, tearing down what existed before and replacing it rapidly. Sarah's house mirrored this national behavior on a smaller scale. It was expansion without reconciliation. Just as America rarely stopped to ask, who paid the price for progress? The house rarely paused to ask whether it should exist in its current form. It simply continued. Rooms accumulated like unresolved questions. Corridors twisted like moral detours. Nothing settled because nothing had been settled historically. Importantly, there is little evidence that Sarah lived in constant terror. Those who interacted with her described calm routines, polite behavior, and deliberate decision-making. This suggests that the construction was not driven by panic, but by belief that action mattered. That movement was protective. That creation was safer than stagnation. In this way, the house functioned almost like a prayer performed with wood and nails. Each addition acknowledged unseen forces, memory, consequence, history, without naming them directly. Each alteration suggested responsiveness, as if the structure itself were listening and adjusting. The belief that stopping construction would invite death is often interpreted literally, but it can also be understood symbolically. Stopping meant confronting silence. Stopping meant facing the completed shape of a life defined by loss. As long as the house was unfinished, Sarah's story was unfinished too. When construction finally stopped, instantly, upon her death, the symbolism was unavoidable. Workers were dismissed mid-task. Tools were left where they lay. The noise ceased. For the first time in decades, the house became still. What no superstition could accomplish, mortality did. The collision of fear, guilt, and wealth created something unique. A living structure shaped not by utility or status, but by psychological necessity. The Winchester House was not built to be admired. It was built to absorb emotion. Its endless construction externalized an internal struggle that had no language in its time. This is why the house resists simple explanation. It was not insanity, nor pure superstition, nor clever eccentricity. It was what happens when a grieving person is given infinite means and no cultural framework for processing trauma tied to collective violence. In the end, the nonstop construction stands as a rare historical artifact, not of architecture, but of conscience. It shows what happens when fear is not confronted, guilt is not absolved, and wealth removes all limits. The result is not collapse, but continuation without resolution. A house that kept growing because its purpose was never to be finished. The legend of the Winchester Mystery House did not emerge naturally from the walls Sarah Winchester built. It was constructed afterward. Layer by layer, through myth, media, and a distinctly American fascination with curses. What began as a private life marked by grief and eccentric architectural choices was transformed into a national ghost story because America has always preferred supernatural explanations to uncomfortable history. The Winchester House became legendary not because it was truly haunted, but because the culture needed it to be. At the time of Sarah Winchester's death in 1922, she was not widely known as a cursed recluse. Newspapers reported her passing respectfully, describing her as a wealthy widow who lived quietly and avoided public life. There were no screaming headlines about ghosts demanding endless construction. The shift came almost immediately afterward, when the house, suddenly silent after decades of nonstop building, was open to the public. What visitors encountered was strange, confusing, and unlike any home they had ever seen. America, faced with something it could not easily rationalize, reached for myth. The early 20th century was a golden age for sensationalism. Newspapers competed fiercely for attention, and exaggerated stories sold better than sober explanations. The Winchester house was perfect material. It looked irrational. It defied architectural norms. It invited speculation. Reporters began filling gaps in knowledge with dramatic narratives, gradually reframing Sarah Winchester from a grieving widow into a haunted heiress fleeing vengeful spirits. The truth, that grief, spiritual beliefs, and unlimited wealth shaped her behavior, was far less marketable. American culture has long been drawn to the idea of curses, especially when wealth is involved. From European royal bloodlines to American industrial fortunes, there is a persistent belief that great wealth must carry a dark price. This belief serves a psychological purpose. It allows society to enjoy stories of riches while reassuring itself that no one escapes consequence. If someone gains too much, something must be taken in return. The Winchester fortune was particularly vulnerable to this narrative because of its origin. Guns occupy a conflicted place in American identity. They are celebrated as tools of independence and freedom, yet associated with violence, death, and moral discomfort. Framing Sarah Winchester as cursed allowed Americans to symbolically confront the violence of westward expansion without directly criticizing it. The problem was not the rifle or the nation that used it. It was the curse that followed the money. Media storytelling amplified this framing relentlessly. Tour guides embellished details to entertain visitors. Hallways that made sense structurally were described as attempts to confuse spirits. Earthquake damage was reinterpreted as supernatural punishment. Coincidences were elevated into proof. Over time, repetition hardened speculation into fact. Once a story is told often enough, it stops being questioned. Hollywood further cemented the legend. As horror films gained popularity, the Winchester house fit neatly into familiar tropes. The haunted mansion, the grieving woman, the restless dead. Films, books, and television specials simplified the story into something recognizable and emotionally satisfying. Subtlety was discarded. Complexity was flattened. Sarah Winchester became a character rather than a person. This process reflects a broader American habit of myth-making. When history becomes uncomfortable, when it forces reflection on violence, inequality, or moral responsibility, myth steps in to soften the impact. Ghost stories externalize guilt. They turn human consequences into supernatural ones. Instead of asking how many lives were destroyed during westward expansion, it is easier to ask how many ghosts roam a hallway. The obsession with curses also reveals something about American attitudes toward accountability. A curse implies inevitability rather than choice. If Sarah Winchester was doomed by spirits, then no one needs to examine the systems that produced her fortune. Curses absolve societies of responsibility by suggesting that suffering is mystical rather than structural. Tourism played a critical role in sustaining the legend. Once the Winchester house became a commercial attraction, the story had to remain mysterious to remain profitable. Visitors did not come to see a case study in grief psychology or post-Civil War spiritual culture. They came to be frightened. They wanted secrets, whispers, and chills. The house adapted to meet that expectation, becoming a stage set for America's appetite for the paranormal. This appetite grew throughout the 20th century. As traditional religious belief declined, fascination with ghosts, hauntings, and curses increased. Paranormal explanations filled the emotional space once occupied by theology. Shows investigating haunted locations treated the Winchester house as evidence rather than metaphor. The more technology failed to detect anything supernatural, the more mystery seemed confirmed. Importantly, these narratives often ignored Sarah Winchester's own voice. She left no diary explaining her actions. This silence made her ideal for mythologizing. A woman who did not explain herself could be explained by others. Her privacy became suspicious. Her solitude became madness. Her spirituality became terror. In a society uncomfortable with women who reject public roles, myth provided a convenient framework for control. The legend also reflects how America treats women with power. Wealthy men who behaved eccentrically were often labeled geniuses. Wealthy women were labeled unstable. Sarah Winchester's architectural decisions were not interpreted as creative or symbolic. They were pathologized. The haunted house narrative functioned as a cultural warning. Women who control wealth, reject marriage, and live independently must be punished, if not in life, then in story. Over time, the myth eclipsed history entirely. The Winchester house ceased to be about a specific woman in a specific era and became a floating symbol of fear. Visitors no longer asked why Sarah Winchester built as she did. They asked what spirits wanted. The shift from inquiry to entertainment was complete. Yet the persistence of the legend says more about America than about Sarah Winchester. It reveals a nation uncomfortable with unresolved history. The house stands at the intersection of expansion, violence, grief, and wealth. Topics that resist clean conclusions. Myth offers closure where history does not. The American obsession with curses is ultimately an obsession with moral balance. It reflects a desire to believe that injustice is punished, even if only symbolically. But symbols can become distractions. By focusing on haunted staircases, Americans avoid confronting the human cost of the rifles that paid for them. The Winchester Mystery House became legendary not because it proves the supernatural, but because it allowed Americans to tell a story that felt satisfying. A cursed mansion is easier to understand than a grieving woman navigating inherited violence. Ghosts are easier to face than history. In the end, the legend endures because it performs cultural work. It turns guilt into entertainment, grief into spectacle, and architectural confusion into cosmic punishment. The house did not create the myth. The myth was waiting for a house like this to inhabit. And so the story continues, retold with each generation, less about Sarah Winchester, and more about America's enduring need to believe that its darkest chapters are haunted rather than authored. The Winchester Mystery House does not stand as proof of ghosts roaming America's past. It stands as proof of something far more unsettling. It is a monument to grief left unresolved, to wealth built on violence, and to a nation that preferred legends over accountability. Sarah Winchester did not create a cursed house, America did. Through myth, fear, and fascination. The country turned history into a ghost story, so it wouldn't have to confront the human cost behind the fortune. In the end, the house remains unfinished not because spirits demanded it, but because some chapters of American history were never meant to feel complete. And perhaps that is the real haunting. The parts of the past that still echo, not in whispers from the dead, but in the stories we choose to tell instead of the truth.